Hi, everybody. This is Rabbi David Mark, and currently I'm trying to figure out why my screen is so small, but that really shouldn't disturb us one bit. I'm really glad to see you today. Thank you for attending. My subject area today is Martin Buber. Martin Buber was a philosopher who may not really be so important today, but I think if I were one of his groupies, I would want him to come back. And just adjusting myself here. Let me just share with you. Possibly the best biography of Buber is this. It's called Martin Buber, An Intimate Portrait, written by a formerly South African Jew by the name of Aubrey Hodes, Hodes. I do not know Mr. Hodes. I did Google him because that's how you become acquainted these days. And there was really very little to say about him. I don't know if he's alive or whatever. I know that he wrote this book, which I picked up. When you're a book collector, you don't know where these things come from. They just accumulate and you're glad for them. And sometimes you misplace them, and then sometime later, when you're looking for something else, they inevitably swim into your line of vision. But it's a lovely book. It really is. And I think I've had it since '82, which would put it in my very first pulpit in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Hey, Fayetteville, if you're up there. Okay. Well, Hodes writes about living in Israel back in the in the early 50s. It was the early 50s. These were very difficult times for Israel. There was strict rationing. They were trying to absorb entire populations of Jews coming to them, making aliyah from the Arab countries. And a lot of those folks were living in tent cities, as a matter of fact. Well, um, here we go. I can make myself bigger because that's the only thing the world needs. There I am. Hello. Anyway, Aubrey Hose was living on a kibbutz, which was not unusual in those days, and I'm pretty sure Bernie Sanders must have been there about the same time. But in the case of Hodes, who of course was an English speaker, although I suspect his Hebrew got better as he lived there, he had a problem. He had an aunt, a dear beloved aunt, who sadly had some sort of dementia. And she was living in a mental hospital, or as they called it in those days, an asylum, and he didn't really know what to do. He would go to Jerusalem from the kibbutz once a week, and that consisted of him getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and riding in the back of the kibbutz truck, which was taking cans of milk, icy cold cans, to the market. And he had distinct memories because obviously, as a kibbutznik, you're going to be wearing shorts. You don't wear them at night, though. If people wear shorts at night, it's considered very gauche, very country bumpkinish. Anyway, 3 o'clock in the morning, he's on the truck. He's going to town to get on the bus to go to Jerusalem, which is the where the mental hospital is, where his aunt is. And he remembers distinctly feeling those ice cold cans against his legs when he would take the trip. From there, he got on the bus. It was a long ride, and he went to the mental hospital, and he would sit there. And sometimes he would sit with her for a time, or they would walk in the garden. It was very sad. He never left there feeling happy. He felt that his aunt was slipping away from him. There was no way that he could possibly reach her. And then one day, after this depressing meeting, he recalled what a friend of his from university had told him. He said, the hospital where your aunt is very close to the home, the apartment of, I don't know if it was a home or an apartment, of Martin Buber, the great philosopher who was teaching at the Hebrew University. Why don't you give him a call? He has said for many, many years that he is always happy to speak with students. So by all means, give him a buzz and meet up with him. Well, Aubrey went to one of those phone booths, and those of you who are in Israel, as late as the '70s, can remember those sad public phones that they had. You couldn't use regular coins. You had to go to a store or a newsstand and pay a couple of not shekels, they had no shekels, it was lira, for asimonim, they were called, asimonim, which is a derivation of the word siman, for sign. And you would have a handful of these things, and you'd put them in the slot, and they wouldn't go down immediately. No, they would sit there in a quiet little pile while you spoke on the phone. And depending on how long your call was and how long the distance was, the asimonim, the coins, would just drop through the slot and you'd never see them again. But it was usually the case that you would get a couple back. And I'll never forget, of course, when I came home from Israel, certainly I had a few of those in my pocket. And I may even have one or two lying around the drawer somewhere. Well, he called Bubar's number. His friend had given it to him, and Bubar picked up the phone and he answered the way he always did. Bubar. You don't say hello, I guess, if you're Germanic. And Aubrey explained to him the situation, and Buber said, well, he says, if you want to speak, why don't you just come over now? I'm not terribly busy, and I'll be glad to talk to you. So Aubrey Hodes went over to his house, and they sat and they talked. And the thing was, Buber was a wonderful listener. He wouldn't jump into the conversation until the speaker had finished his story. And Hodes discusses how his aunt was slipping away from him and how hard it was living on kibbutz. Not that he wanted to leave. He was very dedicated to the Israeli people, the Jewish people. And of course, with all that absorption they were doing between the Holocaust victims and the Jews from the Arab countries, it was always very busy. So Buber says to him, when you're speaking to someone who has difficulty mentally, you have got to use your mind to penetrate theirs. Deep inside that person, whether they are handicapped or mentally ill or anything like that, is a human being. And you have got to strive mightily to connect with that human being. And look, I'm not saying it was a complete success, but reading that as a young rabbi myself, I have really always tried to, again, penetrate through the outside, regardless of the mental or physical challenges that person has. There is a person inside, so that you speak, as I would say, neshama to neshama, soul to soul. It's not always the easiest thing to do. Well, they got very friendly, and Aubrey would come visit Buber from time to time and got the idea for writing the book that I showed you. But also, he finally got up the nerve to ask, why is it, Professor Buber, that you have time to speak to the young? And Buber said, I believe the young are the future of this country. And more than that, I have got to leave some sort of talking legacy. And that's very important. And Aubrey Hodes pressed him, and finally Buber said, when I was a young professor in Berlin, and I was first starting out, and I had my PhD in my hand, and I was very enthusiastic, and I would very often, well, at the time I got interested in Hasidism. And of course, Buber was never a religious person. He had been raised religious. I'll tell you his background later on. But I became so enamored of the idea of Hasidism, the idea of putting yourself in a trance, trying to commune with the Godhead, trying to get to the truth behind the Torah and the other holy books. He said that one day I had just come down from one of my Hasidic-induced trances, and one of my students had come to see me. And of course, I welcomed him in. He sat on the chair, and I sat in my desk chair, and he spoke. And he didn't say very much. He asked a few questions about the course. He asked how he was doing. I told him he was doing fine, and everything seemed to be going well. And then he said, well, thank you, Professor. Thank you for your time. He got up and he left. And I found out later that student had committed suicide. And I never forgave myself for this, because I was the last person he spoke to on this earth. And because I was so overoccupied with myself and my own spiritual journey and my own Hasidic trances and whatnot, I didn't really listen to him with a full heart. Perhaps I could have stopped him from killing himself. And so, said Buber, as a result, I have resolved to always listen with all of my strength to those students and other young people who come to see me. Well, that is the story, and I've told that story many times. But the story of Buber's own childhood is that in the late 1800s, his parents were getting divorced, and he was sent to live with his grandfather. His grandfather was wealthy. his grandfather had a farm, which I believe was fairly unusual for Jewish people because there was a period, in the Middle Ages mostly, when we were not allowed to own property, when we were not allowed to own immovable property, meaning karka, meaning that's the Talmudic term for land, for real estate. And this grandfather had a farm, and he had workers, and he had animals. And Buber said especially what caught his eye one day was he went into the stable because he had free run of the place when he wasn't reading from his grandfather's extensive library. His grandfather was not only a farmer, he was a scholar, and he was published. He had written to various journals. And Buber discovered an enormous bay horse. Now, what is bay? Is that gray? I think it's gray. This was, the way he described it, sounded like one of those Clydesdales from the beer ad. But what happened was, you know that horses are incredibly intelligent. And Buber stood there, and he patted the horse, and he looked into its eyes, and he felt an absolute stirring, as though the horse had touched his very soul. And that was when he got the very first notion of his most famous work, which is called I Thou. Now, I believe that I Thou is the most important part of Buber's philosophy. Certainly, it's the one that's lasted the longest. And I think we need it now. I absolutely think we need it now. Now, I'm so glad you've invited me to be part of your life just for the hour and listen to what I have to say. And of course, this will be taped as well. But the point is this: the technology gets in the way. I so look forward to the end of this terrible plague where we can just sit around and talk to each other the way human beings were meant to. Not with me alone in a study, not with you alone in your dwelling, but rather as human beings, face to face, possibly to touch, to hug, to shake hands at least. That is the true mission of human beings. So now let me explain to you about I Thou. Well, I already explained to you that Buber had a very close relationship with this horse. I'm sure the horse reciprocated, that sort of thing. But our particular challenge is to become closer to other human beings. And let me just tell one more little bit about the technology thing, and then we can move on. In the course of their meetings, Hodes brought a tape recorder to his meeting with Buber. And Buber looked at it. It looked very suspicious. And even though he certainly knew he was being Socratic, Talmudic, he said to Hodes, "What is the purpose of that machine?" And Hodes said, "Well, Professor, it's to tape us. It'll hear what I say. It'll hear what you say. And then it'll make it easier for me to write the article or whatever it is." And Buber said, "I don't like it. Please don't use it. Because you see, if you put that machine between us, we are not speaking to each other anymore. We are speaking to the machine. And that I cannot abide." And this was very primitive machinery. This was probably a big old Wallensack or something, reel-to-reel tape recorder. But you could see the reasoning behind it. And yet Buber never could have imagined that this terrible plague would afflict us. So I don't know, maybe he'd have cut some slack to the tape recorder or to the live aspect that I'm dealing with here on Facebook. Well, anyway, Buber grows up and he, I Thou, okay. I Thou. I and Thou means that you are able to relate to another human being in the closest, sincerest sense, not the erotic sense, but rather the idea that I have my dreams and aspirations, you do as well, and somehow or other we can meet in the middle. I relate to you as a fellow spirit equal to me. Now, if you're standing online in the supermarket, as who isn't these days, and even though the supermarket clerks have gotten extra training for dealing with the public during the coronavirus plague, nonetheless, you might be looking at that clerk and thinking, "Oh, she's a trainee. She's got that badge on. I saw how she treated the previous two customers. Now she's coming to me. I'm in such a hurry. I hate being here," and all of that business. You are no longer, not that it's possible to gain the acquaintance of a grocery clerk in such a short amount of time, but you are no longer relating to her as a thou. You're relating to her as an it. anyone, any other human being whom we look upon as a barrier to us, who is not delivering what we want them to, who is a service person and we don't like the services. You see, we have denied them their humanity. We are making them an it. We are not making them a thou. And it doesn't only apply to human beings, it can apply to animals. If you love your animal, that's wonderful. I think we all do. But then if you come home in a mood, and I'm sure you too have come home in a mood, and you find the cat lying on your favorite cashmere blouse or sweater or whatever it is, it would not be unusual for the owner of the cat, although I don't think cats have owners, to pick up the animal and toss it as far away as they can, which is very sad for the cat. But you see, once again, you are relating to the cat not at all. You are viewing the cat as an it. Also, growing things, trees. You can look at a tree, you can say, oh, you're an organism, I'm an organism, you have leaves, you convert carbon dioxide into oxygen. Or you could say, man, that tree is big. I'm going to get a tree service to cut that sucker down because it's blocking my view of the pool. You see? It's all I, thou. And sadly, in this world, there are leaders, there are followers, there are too darn many people who look upon other human beings not as thou, but rather as it. What can I get out of this person? How can I exploit this person? You see? Well, anyway, some of the tales from Hodes's book. Here we have, for example, how he met the woman he eventually married. Leipzig in 1900. Beautiful. You see, this is all fin de siècle, the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, which began with so much possibility. Now, of course, 14 years later, they were in World War I. But he belongs to a Zionist club, and he meets the great Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was a tragic figure in Jewish history. He dies very young. He has a poor heart. One of his children converts to Christianity. The other one jumps off a bridge. It's all very sad. But Herzl himself, his influence was impossible to enumerate. His influence is something we feel even today, even though I think he died while in his 40s. And the he believed in Zionism as a political and cultural movement. Politics, why? Because Israel, Palestine was just a sad little backwater of the Turkish Empire, and Herzl met with the Kaiser, and he thought the Kaiser would surely help them found a Jewish state in the Middle East, because the Kaiser, after all, wanted, they were all building world empires, and it was England and then France, and after that only Germany. But Buber did not agree with Herzl in the sense of only politics, only culture. He believed that it should be a spiritual movement as well, one which could renew the spiritual soul of the land of Israel, in addition, of course, making it a refuge for the Plitim, for the refugees, for the Jews who were coming there from Russia mostly, and other parts of Europe, and a couple of Americans too, but not very many. Well, so they went to a meeting, and he became editor of Die Welt, the official Zionist organ, and another writer was a young woman named Paula Winkler, who, in spite of her Jewish-sounding name, was Catholic. She eventually converts to Judaism and marries Buber, which is very nice. He goes to Eastern Europe, he explores the Hasidim, and he gains a certain connection with them. But again, it's very hard to be a Hasid if you're not religious. Indeed, for us postmodern Jews, the Hasidim are the most religious people around, laying aside the politics and the different dynasties and who marries whom and so on and so forth. But indeed, according to one article I read, Chaim Potok, he who wrote The Chosen, did not like Buber for this concentration on Hasidism, because he said they practice obscurantism and they have their own internecine fights, and they're not the cleanest people. I was very surprised to see Chaim Potok react that way because he grew up in Brooklyn. He must have been surrounded by Hasidim. Well, let's take a look at some of his sayings. Okay, the thing is, he's very quotable. Okay, and I have to warn you. Certainly, you should try some of his books, such as Between God and Man. But really, I and Thou is the place to start. A lot of his stuff is very Germanic and turgid. Okay, here we go. Let's have a look. Every morning I shall concern myself about the boundary between the love deed yes and the power deed no, and pressing forward honor reality. We cannot avoid using power, cannot escape the compulsion to afflict the world. So let us, cautious in diction and mighty in contradiction, love powerfully. That's Buber from 1926. 1926 was a very bad time in Germany. They had lost the war, and at the Paris Conference in 1919, the Allies, America, England, France, Italy, imposed a terrible reparations package on Germany, telling them they had to pay the money back. So Buber was clearly concerned with the idea of military power because he wanted to see the world living at peace. And I love what he says here by the love deed yes and the power deed no. Apparently, those who have the ability to say no are those who are stronger than the others, and they are the ones who are able to call the shots. But we can say yes to life if we let love guide our thoughts and feelings. And you could say, well, that's a little bit of pie in the sky by and by. Okay, but we need ideals, frankly. The universe is not really going the way it ought to. Okay? All right. Life, in that it is life, necessarily entails justice. Okay, it'd be great to get some feedback on this one, but I don't know if I can. It's a one-way track, really. Life entails justice. Yeah, I guess so. Okay, I mean, if you live in a world where the strong oppress the weak and the strong leaders, quote unquote, are not doing what they're supposed to do, there has got to be justice. Okay, here we go. Now this is very nice. This is one of his mystical pronouncements because he wrote about the Baal Shem Tov. I have to say I've got his book of Hasidic stories. Some of them are really good. Some of them don't quite hit the ball out of the park. All journeys have secret destinations of which the traveler is unaware. I honestly don't think I've ever read a fantasy story that didn't have that as its theme. You set out to go, but life is like that too. I mean, think for a moment, and Lord knows we've all had plenty of time to think with being sequestered and everything. When you started out in life, did you think that things would go this way? Okay, I always remember that many, many, many years ago, I had this vision of myself sitting under the spreading chestnut tree in my corduroy blazer with the leather patches on the sleeves, teaching English. Well, I did get to teach English, and I do enjoy being a rabbi. But again, the details, it's like the Robert Frost poem, "Whose woods these are." No, that's a different one. Let's see. That is "Two roads diverge in a yellow wood." Okay? All right, here we are. I do not accept any absolute formulas for living. No preconceived code can see ahead to everything that can happen in a person's life. As we live, we grow and our beliefs change. They must change. So I think we should live with this constant discovery. We should be open to this adventure and heightened awareness of living. We should stake our whole existence on our willingness to explore and experience. It doesn't mean you put on a pith helmet and those British bloomer shorts and a pair of high lace-up boots and go off into the jungle to find yourself. No, it can be a journey of the mind. It can be an interior trip, and that's important. But you'll notice this is his clever little way of getting back at his traditional childhood, his traditional upbringing, because his grandfather, the farmer, was also strictly Orthodox. No preconceived code can see ahead to everything that can happen in a man's life. Well, come on, all right? He's saying Jewish law doesn't work for me. Of course, you can certainly disagree, and I welcome you to do so. You can put a question and a comment in the question box over there on my left, and thank you to those who have done that. But I don't know, you got to have something. You got to have some outline. You got to have some basis. Okay? It's not like you can say, oh, it's Pesach, I'll light the menorah. You see what I'm saying? I've said for years we do not invent Judaism when we get up in the morning. Somehow or other, we have got to pay heed to the thousands and thousands and millions of Jews who have come before us. Rabbis, lay people, school teachers, thinkers, all of those people. But what I love about this faith is that you are given a great deal of latitude within the corpus, within the body of the law. And do I consider Buber a faithful Jew? Yeah, I do, but he was a thinker. He wasn't sociological like Mordechai Kaplan. He was quasi-mystical, not so far as Abraham Joshua Heschel, but he does have his own particular niche. Here we go. All right. When we rise out of the night into the new life and there begin to receive the signs, what can we know of God who gives them to us? Only what we experience from time to time from the signs themselves. If we name the speaker of this speech God, then it is always the God of a moment God. Well, first, I agree with him 100% on that first point, which is that God's not going to appear to you like a golden angel in your bedroom at midnight, standing there with the golden book and pen and saying, okay, this is what's going to happen to you for the rest of your life. Nobody ever gets that kind of insight into the future. But rather, if you look, it's what I call whisper theology, whisper theophany, that God will appear to you. I'll tell you a story. This is something from my first pulpit. What happened was, if you're the only temple in town except for the Jewish chapel on base, and you're one of two rabbis, and the other rabbi, who gets changed frequently being a military chaplain, is not terribly happy, you meet a lot of different kinds of people. And I got a call, and I met one night in the temple with this young army doctor and his fiancée, who, surprise, surprise, was a young military nurse, and they wanted to get married. And the bride came from a traditional background, and she absolutely wanted a rabbi to officiate. The groom came from a secular background, and he really hadn't been close to any rabbis, and he wanted to meet with me to find out my way of thinking, the cut of my jib. I don't understand that because I'm not very naval. Okay, and so we talked. And in the course of our conversation, I said that I was feeling, I don't know if I feel this way anymore, I felt this way then, never a leaf falls from a tree, but God wills it. Everything in this world is subject to God's will. And he said, well, you know, as a physician, I'm a scientist, and I believe that if a leaf falls from the tree, it's nature killing the leaf and telling it to do what it's supposed to do. It's pre-programmed. And we talked some more, and the bride spoke as well. And finally, the young man said to me, you know, Rabbi, I can't say I agree with you, but based on what you've been saying, I respect you sufficiently, and I'd be glad for you to officiate at our wedding. And I said, oh, okay, great, thank you. So I guided them out, and I locked the door, and I started going up the path. It was a long path. The parsonage, the rabbi's house, was directly behind the shul. And that was a mixed blessing, of course, but I won't tell you the reason for that right now. And as I'm walking, it's a perfectly windless night in North Carolina. And all of a sudden, a single leaf skitters across my path. And I smiled. God was speaking to me. I felt as though God were telling me, good job, you carried the ball, you kept the team for Judaism tonight. Well done, my good and faithful servant. And I felt good about it. But you see, that is what I call whisper theophany. If you're in the right place at the right time. I'm not talking about tragedy. I'm not talking about doom, defeat, despair, things like that. I'm just talking about getting through the day, okay? Now, obviously, if you're sitting in your living room, the odds of leaves blowing by your feet are somewhat limited. But you see what I'm saying? Metaphorical leaves, perhaps. Okay. And as far as living by a code, I don't totally agree with Buber on this one, because after all, he was living his Judaism the best he could. His entire career, he was hoping for a binational state. He had the support of Bertrand Russell, various church people, mostly Protestant, and so on and so forth. Excuse me. Anyway, he wanted a state, not a Jewish state. He wanted a state for Arabs and Jews to live together and progress and learn from each other. And as you know, and I'm sure you follow current events the same as I do. Current events tonight at 7 o'clock, by the way, right here. Anyway, um, just that it didn't happen. Israel is a fortress. The best history of Israel I've ever read is called The Siege. And the Arabs, well, they've made peace with several Arab nations through the back door, the Saudis, the Abu Dhabis, I think, and a few other people, the United Arab Emirates, and so on. And that's frankly an acquaintance, a friendship, let's say a relationship of need, because Israel has the technology and the Arabs want and need it and can afford to pay for it. And I'm not going to get all political on you, but what's going to happen to the Palestinians? I don't know. Well, I'll have more to say about that with current events. Here we go. The thou encounters me by grace. It cannot be found by seeking. Okay, wait a minute. Wait. There's a wonderful poem called The Hound of Heaven, in which this person, the narrator, the speaker, chases after God. And I was so inspired by it. That's why I call my blog Deity Chaser, because I think in so many ways we are always chasing after God, for good or for evil. And of course, my favorite Jewish expression is, if God lived on earth, people would break his windows. But this expression, the thou encounters me by grace, it cannot be found by seeking. But that I speak the basic word to it is a deed of my whole being, is my essential deed. Okay, well, that's the thou, all right, meaning that if you have a relationship with an animal, with a plant, with another human being, hopefully, with whom you can be totally yourself without any pretense, because we all wear so many hats. And here, I'll give you an example. This is an old story. There was a man who was always late and he could never find himself. And somebody said, why don't you keep a list? So that's what he did. Before he went to sleep one night, he said, he wrote, hat in the closet, pants on the hanger, jacket on the chair, and handkerchief in the drawer, and so on and so forth. And the next morning, he got up an hour earlier than he usually did, and following his list, he was able to find every article of clothing you could possibly think of. But then, as he stood there with the list in his hand, he said, but where am I? Where am I myself? How can I find me? And too many people in this world, I believe, are in search of themselves, but they don't have a clue how to do it. And Buber is saying human relationships. Through meeting other human beings, we encounter God, because we are all made with B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Chaim. All right. Let's see. The basic word I, thou can be spoken only with one's whole being. The concentration and fusion into a whole being can never be accomplished by me, can never be accomplished without me. I require a thou to become. Becoming I say thou. Here again, human relationships. And it's not like any single friend or loved one may fulfill all of your needs. Hopefully, if it's your loved one, that's it. You work at that, man. You absolutely work at that. But just in terms of human acquaintances, if you can find someone to whom you relate, to whom you can be yourself, that is crucial. Okay, what else? An animal's eyes have the power to speak a great language. Oh yeah, you got a pet, he can penetrate to your soul, he or she. And people say, oh my gosh, look, she knows I'm leaving. I'm going to get my keys. Well, yes, because our pets are little anthropologists. And all they ever do is watch you. They're looking at you. They know what you're going to do next because you've done it a million jillion times before. Okay, here we go. Now let's talk God. Everybody, you see, there are several ways to do this in Judaism. You've got Kabbalah, you've got mysticism, you've got meditation. Intellect is the road that I prefer. And you've got folks who just daven. That's it. That's enough for them. Because, well, this is a Reconstructionist phrase, but maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist. It's time to daven. So why do we daven? We daven because we need it. And how you daven, whether you come from the read every single word school of thought, or you come from repeat the same line school of thought. That's where I live, okay? I grew up, it was all, what's your hurry, Omein? The quickest guy could get through the davening, boom, we're done. As a matter of fact, a lot of shuls advertise, we have the quickest davening in town. What's the point? That is why I choose. I look at the prayer, it's not like I haven't looked at it before, and I choose a line which speaks to me at that particular moment. At this time, what I've been doing with the Amidah is I repeat the first line. Adonai sfatai tiftach ufi agi tilatecha. O Lord, open my lips that my mouth shall declare your praise. And this, I feel, is such an important and poetic and elemental and spiritual prayer. Because I am saying, yes, I have the power of speech. Of all the creatures on this earth, only human beings have the power of speech. But how do we use it? And that is why, when I'm davening, I ask God, oh Lord, open my lips. God, you do it. You assist me. You help me. Oh, you know me. And those of you who know me know I can talk till the cows come home. But it is the substance behind the words that counts. And for this, we rely on a power, whether it is mental or cosmic. And we call that power God. And we need this God now more than ever before, because humanity is in pain. And our neighbors, our families, our brothers and sisters are in need of our concern and our prayers. And this is sort of like a Seder Bubar, a Bubar study session, and I'm dedicating it to all the folks in need of our prayers. All right, looking at this here, persons appear by entering into relation to other persons. We've been saying that right along. Clearly, human beings make very bad hermits. Oh, there's that old chestnut. I'm telling the joke that's been told a lot. Where the Jew is washed ashore on the desert island, and he builds. And about a year later, when the Coast Guard or the Navy come to get him, they find that he has built not one, but 2 grass shacks. And they say to him, Mr. Jewish castaway person, why did you build 2 grass shacks? One would have been sufficient. And he points at one, and he says, that's the one I daven in, and that one I wouldn't go to if you paid me. So you see, even all by themselves, Jews can argue, Jews can be exclusionary. Okay. Now the word God, let's see. When I say God, what do you think? Let's just be quiet for a couple of minutes and decide about that. Okay. God. God is a deity. God is a power. God is a spirit. God has many names in Judaism. Adonai, which means master, and a lot of Israelis don't care for that because they are a free people and they don't like the idea of a master. Hashem. Hashem is a nice Hamish way of saying God because it means the name. Whose name? God's name, which places a certain distance between ourselves and God. Elohim. Elohim is a collective. It means God as well, but it is God's, all right? And that goes back to at least the Babylonian era, if not earlier, where El was the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. So Elohim is a collective God. It could mean the good, it could mean the bad, it could mean God in heaven, God on earth, God in our hearts, God in our temples, all of that business. But according to Buber, some would deny any legitimate use of the word God because it has been misused so much. Certainly, it is the most burdened of all human words. Precisely for that reason, it is the most imperishable and unavoidable. I'll read the remainder, but I don't know why he's contradicting himself. He says that God is the most important word, but it's been overused. Well, what are you going to do? I gotta call God something. I think it's also because God is infinite, God is without beginning, God is without end. It's very hard to sum up all that godness into one word, and yet we do it. Because the idea of using language is that we need points of reference. That is a cup, that is a printer, this is a can, over there is the other screen, and so on. And by my using these words, people I speak to are able to recognize that, oh, well, he's using a reference, and I may have those objects in my house as well. But what about God? What about God? Let's see what else he has to say. For whoever pronounces the word God and really means thou, addresses, no matter what his delusion, the true thou of his life that cannot be restricted by any other, and to whom he stands in a relationship that includes all others. Okay, now you're showing your colors, Professor Buber. There you go. See? He's not referring to the old man up there with the long beard in the big chair. That doesn't really operate in Judaism. Obviously, it operates in art, it operates in Catholic belief, things like that, but not in Judaism. Our God is right in front of us. Your God is the person to whom you're speaking to. It's not that you're worshiping them. It's just that you're recognizing your own humanity with regard to their humanity. That's the thing. All right. The world is not divine sport, it is divine destiny. There is divine meaning in the life of the world, of man, of human persons, of you and me. So, what is divine meaning? What sort of divine meaning have you been embracing today, this moment, currently? Well, I think learning is crucial because it helps us to stretch our minds. And Buber is really, I mean, when you come down to it, at least in the I thou idea, he's fairly conventional. That's a good thing. It is significant that all of our great thinkers came from German backgrounds. Well, Soloveitchik, Rabbi Soloveitchik, Harav Soloveitchik, let him rest in peace. I think he was from Latvia, not Lithuania, excuse me, Lithuania. The idea was that the Lithuanian Jews were very bookish and they absolutely knew their Talmud as opposed to half of me, which is my mother's half, which is Galiciana. The Galicians were a little more carefree and they enjoyed life and that sort of thing. Okay? All right, here we go. Now, if you regard yourself, do you regard yourself as an object? So long as you have yourself as an object, your experience of man is only as of a thing among things. Well, let's figure this out. Again, it's impossible to generalize. There are certain beliefs we Jews have about ourselves, and we entertain these beliefs. We really like them, but whether they apply or not, I don't know. Jews are supposed to be intellectual. Jews are supposed to love reading, and I guess that applies to most of the Jewish folk that I've met. But obviously, there are folks who are not like that. There are folks who enjoy other things. You can be bookish and enjoy sports. You can like plain food and yet go out for French cuisine every so often. But somebody who regards themselves as an object, a money-making machine, or someone who is just living, and that's very sad. That is tragic. Rambam, Maimonides, in talking about the human soul, the neshama, of course, we've discussed this before, but you'll forgive me for repeating. The nephesh, the animal soul, that which gets us up in the morning, has us brush our teeth, do our business, get dressed, go out, meet the day, back when you could still do those things. That is the nephesh, that is the animal soul. The neshama, on the other hand, is the spiritual soul. And that is incredibly crucial because that is a little piece of God, that is a tiny flame from God, which reaches up to God for as long as we are alive, the way a candle flame reaches up to heaven. And neither of these things, I mean, a nefesh, an animal soul, yeah, I guess an animal soul could be an object. If you're just out there running with the bulls day after day after day, you're going to wear yourself out. There's got to be some spiritual component to everybody's life, whatever it is. I know they say you shouldn't kiss books now, but my point is that the books that I have, when I was a kid, they said if it's a sefer, if it's a Jewish book, it's holy. If it's a chumash, if it has God's name in it, it's a siddur, these are all holy. Kiss them. And what I did very quietly years ago was I made the decision that any book, except I think a Christian Bible, I can't bring myself to kiss that, but any book from which I have learned something is worthy of a kiss. You have got to, it's like being a shark. You have got to keep moving, keep learning, keep doing. What is that line? Wonderful. Saul Bellows, my favorite novel, my only favorite novel of his work, Herzog, where you have this sad professor who's lost wife number two. She's run off with a disc jockey. This is back in the 60s. Named Valentine Gersbach. Isn't that a great name, Valentine Gersbach? Anyway, Herzog's wife ran off with the disc jockey, with Valentine. Valentine has a wooden leg also, just to increase his charm. And so what does Herzog do? What does the scholar manqué, the wounded scholar, do? He goes to their home in the Berkshires. They were living in Boston. And they have a cottage there. And he moves in. There's no heat. There's barely any light. I think he has one kerosene lamp. And he bought himself a jar of peanut butter and a jar of jelly and a loaf of bread before he got there. He sleeps on their marriage bed in his coat, using his coat for a cover and a blanket. And he writes. He writes letters to President Eisenhower, to John Kennedy, to actors, actresses, scholars, living and dead, Immanuel Kant, who died, I'm pretty sure, in the mid-1800s. He writes letters to all these people. He writes letters to his parents. He hopes he didn't disappoint them. They're dead, so it really doesn't apply. And then one morning he wakes up and he finds that a mouse ate its way halfway through his loaf of bread. He eats the other half, smeared with jam. You can share with mice too. And I thought, look at this. Look at this Luftmensch, this man who lives in the air. What kind of life is that? But somehow or other, and Herzog comes out with these, a good Wort, he comes out with a good expression from time to time. He says, are you on the knees of your soul? Might as well be useful. Scrub the floor. It happens. What are you going to do? We go up, we go down. Let me just look for a couple more here. When we see a great man who desires power instead of his real goal, we soon recognize that he is sick, or more precisely, that his attitude to his work is sick. Now, remember that Bubar survived the Holocaust. He was lucky to get out of Berlin. He had founded das Jüdische Lehrhaus, the Jewish scholarly house program for adults. He had founded that with Franz Rosenzweig. I must speak about Rosenzweig sometime. He died very young, poor man. Rosenzweig was a great influence on Bubar. And he and Bubar and Rosenzweig together began to translate the Hebrew Bible into German. And there are parts of that available today. And they say it is a beautiful and very lucid translation. But Bubar, he takes in a budding young scholar by the name of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And then Bubar says, I'm going. I'm leaving. The Nazis threw me out of my academic post. I can't teach anymore. I'm going to Jerusalem. And he says, Abraham Joshua Heschel, would you like to take over the Lehrhaus? And Heschel's glad to do it. And until he's able to get out of Germany, and he winds up in Cincinnati at the Hebrew Union College of the Reform Movement. He took that very close as well. So clearly, when Bubar speaks about, when we see a great man desiring power instead of his real goal, we soon recognize that he is sick. Absolute power, this is a cliche, corrupts absolutely. But more than that, if there is a person who lives only for power, it's not going to come to a good end eventually. These are lessons of history. I didn't make this up. Winston Churchill once said, tyrants ride tigers whom they dare not dismount, and the tigers are getting hungry. Hey, I didn't make it up. Churchill did. Love that Churchill. Okay. Oh, melancholy. This is him speaking. He wrote some of the stories of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav's most famous poem, his most famous prayer, are Yidden al tityayesh. Jews, do not despair, because despair is like a black pit, and once you fall in, you can never get out. So here he is allegedly quoting Rabbi Nachman, but Bubar reads the Yiddish, Bubar writes in German, Ludwig Lewison, the novelist, translates it in 1981. So it goes through a lot of translations, okay? Now this is an expression I got from the Norton Anthology. It's kind of chauvinistic, but I hope my female listeners will forgive me. A translation is like a wife. A faithful one is likely to be ugly, and a beautiful translation is likely to be unfaithful. Meaning, you'll read translations, and you'll say, oh, this is gorgeous, like the translation of the Conservative Prayer Book. It's not a translation, it's a paraphrase. And a paraphrase, I feel, softens the blow, not the blow, softens the impact. There you go. And it takes away so much from the meaning. But I'll read this anyway. I think it's pretty good. Avoid melancholy with all your might. It hurts the service of God more than sin. Satan takes less pleasure in sin than in a person's melancholy over having sinned again, and so feeling that he is a slave to sin. Thus the evil one has caught the poor soul in the net of despair. Whoa! You got to keep in mind. See, again, this is, as I say, why did the Jews invent psychology? Because we need it. Prior to the invention of psychology, prior to Freud's birth, you had these Hasidic rebbes who were giving advice to the people. The people would come to them, and he would try to cheer them up and so on. Now, sometimes the situation was reversed. I don't think it was the Alter of Slobodka, but it was one of the Alterim, one of the old men, the old rabbis, who hired Herschel of Ostropol to cheer him up. Herschel comes down to us, and I don't know if we can ever prove that he lived, as sort of the court jester for I think it was Reb Simcha Bunim, who suffered melancholy. And it's a story. I don't know how great it is as a story. But what happens is it's Shabbos, and Herschel is in the Rebbe's study, and Herschel is looking out the window, and the Rebbe finally says, Herschel, what are you looking at? He says, Oi, Rebbe. He says, what's the matter? Why are you Rebbeing me? He says, Oi, Rebbe. He says, there's a cow. He says, so what? There's a cow. There are always cows. Everybody has cows. What do you bother me for? He says, the cow is going into the lake. So the cow's going, maybe she's thirsty. She's getting a nice drink. That'll be fine for her. Oh, Rebbe, she's going further. So, why again, I'm trying to learn here. What are you bothering me for? Rebbe, look, the cow is drowning. Oh, it's going under once, twice, 3 times. That's it, it's drowned. And the Rebbe says, Herschel, what are you bothering me about that for? He says, it's your cow, Rebbe. So you see, okay, I don't know if you enjoyed that particular one, but there's always a story behind the story. And in this case, it's the sin of melancholy, the sin of depression. I'm not talking about, God forbid, a clinical depression, which is something that needs to be treated by a psychiatrist and by therapy, but just the way it is possible to feel in surroundings like the ones in which we find ourselves these days. I mean, I love my house, but I like to get out once in a while. And we do pray for this terrible plague to be over. Okay, we have time for a couple more. Let's have a look. As the oil is in the olive, so is the tshuva, repentance, hidden within sin. That's a good one. That is a good one. There are people, again, al tityayesh, do not be melancholy. There are people who, when they sin, they figure, that's it, I'm doomed, I might as well keep going. Because, let's face it, sinning feels good. but eventually it's going to be painful. It's another story where the father and the little boy go for a bath in the lake in the winter. Only the problem is, it's the lake in the winter. They didn't have indoor plumbing. And they both go down there with their towels, and the father uses an axe to chop the ice, and they both jump in, and the little boy comes out. He's shivering. He's so cold. He says, "Oi, Papa, oi, oi, oi." And the papa wraps him up in the towel and carries him in his arms to the fire, the stove in the house. And the little boy sits in front of the stove and he's getting warm. He says, "Oi, Papa, oi." And the father says, "You see, my son, this is what happens when you sin. It's the opposite of what you just did. When you sin, you go, "Oh, this feels so good." But later on, when you get the punishment for the sin, oy, oy vey is mir. So that is a way of taking a dip in a frozen lake and making it into a Jewish experience. But what Bubar is saying here is much better, because he's saying, yes, you will sin, but the road to teshuvah, to repentance, is hidden within the sin. And here's another one. It's the highest service to submit the evil impulse to God through the power of love. This is fascinating. Here we have the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Hatov. The Yetzer Hatov is the good inclination. That's the one that sits on your right shoulder. The Yetzer Hara is the one that sits on your left shoulder. It's like in the old Looney Tunes cartoons where you would have the devil and the angel on either shoulder of Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck. You could see my misspent youth. And the Yetzer Hara, this is not the devil. I have got to be very careful to differentiate that this is absolutely not the devil. The devil is the prosecuting attorney in the heavenly court, and it is his job after we die, is 120 to 120 years and 6 months, to tell God all the terrible sins that we committed when we were alive. But there's also the Yetzer Hatov, the good inclination. Every time you do a mitzvah, whether you want to or not, you create a new witness for yourself, for the Yetzer Hatov, for the good inclination. And in classic Jewish theology, or just belief, or just tradition, you have this scale. You've seen them, for instance, in a lawyer's office, where the pans of the scale, if you put all the good deeds in one and all the bad deeds in the other, which one is going to be heavier? And you never know, you absolutely do not know which pan is going to be heavier. Nobody knows if they're going to heaven or not, going to reward. Now, this is totally unlike other religions, where if you believe in something, or you have a positive feeling about something, boom, that's it, you're on your way. In Judaism, you absolutely never know. Now, I'm not trying to make people feel paranoid. I'm trying to emphasize that for as long as we live, we have got to do as many mitzvot as we possibly can. There's a statement that says dead people are no longer obligated to do mitzvot. Well, that's very obvious on the face of it, but it's also true that it's a privilege to be alive. That's why we always say l'chaim. That's why we are always for life. And I would say, in closing, we lived in New Hampshire for 22 years. It was wonderful. People were lovely. But there was something I always objected to theologically, and those were the license plates, because the license plates would say, live free or die. And as Jews, we have lived under conditions of such absolute slavery, and we have survived, that I don't honestly, obviously I had it on my car and I couldn't cover it up, but to say live free or die, it sounds very noble and very patriotic. From a Jewish point of view, however, it doesn't quite work. I wanted to say, God bless you all. God keep you safe during this time of plague, and thank you for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.